Social media. I want to welcome in TD Ameritrade Network contributor Jenny Horn to the program here, and let's break down this space that is just so crucial to kind of the new economy, if you will. Reopen, close down, Jenny. Social media is just so powerful in the ad space, in the commerce space, and it's really intertwined fully now, I would say, within the economy.
Absolutely. And I would say, regretfully, it pains me to say that social media is the most influential it's ever been. And I think the pandemic sort of expedited that sort of power it has, because so many people were on their phones. So many people had nothing else to do than to really be on social media. And we actually saw social media app downloads spike the most significantly between March and May of last year, with Snap and Twitter actually being some of the top performers. Their stocks rose about 207 and 69% respectively in 2020. Facebook was up about 33%, and then Pinterest, which actually has seen a degree of pullback from April, they fell about 10% in the month of April, was still up about 222% through the last year ending May 3rd. So that is crazy, astronomical growth. And now we're seeing this slowdown, which makes perfect sense as things are reopening and people have other things to do. But what is really critical are these app downloads as we've seen them grow and then slow. TikTok specifically has seen the most slowdown despite being one of the most downloaded apps in the last year. They had 10 million app downloads in May of 2020 and then just 4.4 million in May of 2021. So more than half they lost over the year. Now, Facebook also saw some reduction. They went from about 5.4 million US app downloads in May to about 3.1 million. But what is really critical with all of these names is that their stocks, some don't necessarily reflect this slowdown in app downloads. Specifically, Facebook and Snap both jumped about 20% this year. Despite the slowdown we're still seeing in these app downloads. So that degree of resiliency, I think, is crucial when looking at these names. But there are so many key challenges ahead. One being, I just listed about 4 different names. Competition is very, very fierce in this space. And although TikTok has seen the biggest degree of slowdown in terms of app downloads, they are still sort of the dominant force in this space. Clubhouse has joined the mix. They actually just announced yesterday they had 2 million downloads on Androids specifically. And then, of course, advertising is huge for all of these names. It's a critical aspect, but actually affecting Facebook the most. Facebook derives about 98% of their total revenue from ad spend. And the digital advertising market has grown over the last year to about 150 billion, which now accounts for about 60% of the total US media ad spend. So social media is really almost synonymous with ad spend at this point. But what so many people on social media are talking about were some of these levels of growth we've seen in these names over the last year. How can they sustain them as people find, say, other things to do? So that actually brings me to our first tweet of the day, which highlights some of the growth in so many of these names. So the first tweeter says, social media over the last year in terms of monthly active users. Facebook went from 2.6 billion to 2.85 billion, which is up 10% year over year. Pinterest, 367 million to 478 million, up 30% year over year. Spotify, 286 million to 356 million, 27% year over year. And then Snapchat, specifically in terms of daily active users, 229 million to 280 million, 22% year over year. And Twitter, last but not least, in terms of monetizable daily active users, 166 million to 199 million, which was up about 20% year over year. Now, Pinterest specifically has seen this slide in April following its earnings report, which were objectively very strong. They said their revenue was up 78% year over year in the first quarter, which included 170% international growth specifically, which is a very important metric. Now, their expectations for second quarter are actually still fairly strong. They're expecting to grow revenue of about 105% year over year. But the one comment they made that the street did not like is they said their second quarter monthly active users will grow in the mid-teens and US monthly active users will be flat on a year over year percentage basis. So that was sort of the key takeaway. Despite the fact that Twitter highlights some of their monthly active user growth over the last year, they are not expected to grow at these same levels, which again, to me makes perfect sense. People are going out to bars, people are going to sporting events and concerts. They're hopefully getting off their phone. But right now, social media is still crucial for so many of these different businesses, whether it's advertisers or e-commerce, which is what our next tweeter sort of focuses on, that e-commerce aspect of things. So our next tweeter says, everyone talking about Pinterest adding e-commerce would be much easier for Etsy to add social media aspects to their already vibrant e-commerce platform. And this could not be any more topical, because then we got news today that actually Etsy is buying Depop for $1.6 billion, which is a secondhand sort of fashion app. But more than that, Depop is really at the sense of community. People go and people talk, and it's actually very cool. I've been on it before, but it is so much more than just, say, a shopping app. It is almost a social media platform in itself. Now, what I think is interesting about all these names is Pinterest has seen this degree of selling, but I think that we live in a world where influencers have the most exposure. Pains me to say that they really do. So I don't think it's necessarily a winner takes all sort of idea in this space. I think that Pinterest right now operates very closely with, say, an Instagram, owned by Facebook, of course. And, influencers will link their Pinterest pages to their Instagram, to their TikToks. So I think that actually Pinterest stands to benefit sort of working mutually with some of these other social media names, TikTok, Instagram, I think being the most Gen Z popular. So I don't think it's a winner takes all. I think really, despite Pinterest's pullback, they stand to be, sort of at the fingertips of so many influencers, which is now, sadly, how so many people shop and how so many people find different fashion trends, Kevin.
Yeah, Jenny, you touched on, if you look at Pinterest chart, right? They had a great earnings report. They had great growth, and they projected great growth. But you said, 37% international growth, basically flat U.S. growth. Well, they're growing, right, as a big firm. Why is that a problem? Here's the why. Because if you look at the average money spent, right, the average U.S. user spends $3.99 per visit. The average international user spends 26 cents. Big difference. Even though they're growing internationally, that's not where the margins come from. They come from the U.S. So the fact that they've been flat around that 98 million U.S. users and holding there is why the stock sold off. But the growth numbers are good. They're still very positive on the underlying, but that took some of the top off this name. The fact that so much U.S. customers spend so much more money than international customers, and U.S. growth is flat, guys. That's why this stock has been heavy lately. Back to you guys.
Guys, can we pull up that tweet from Charlie once again? Because I look at these stats, and what I think is, this looks like it's Facebook's world, and the rest of these companies are just trying to find where they can coexist, to Jenny's point. How can we hook up to Instagram? How can we hook up to Facebook? Because Facebook's 10% year over year growth, that's almost 70% of Snapchat's entire user base. And Facebook's biggest issue at this point looks like it's going to be scale. You just can't grow at those 30% margin levels anymore when you have almost 3 billion users monthly on one of your platforms. So Facebook is just the massive behemoth here, and really it's not even close. So it's just, how can these other companies continue to grow and find their spot within this space? But Jenny, we got to leave it there. Great setup here for us. And look forward to talking to you again soon. As we say goodbye to Jenny, I want to welcome in the VP of Research at LikeFolio.com, Megan Brantley, to the show. Good morning to you, Megan. And so this, I think, is an interesting conversation, because we're going to talk social media, and we're going to look at data of, I guess, people talking about social media on social media.
Yeah, I know. It's kind of like Inception, right? So whenever we look at these, we're looking at these numbers in terms of, consumer demand, people downloading and using these apps, and also consumer happiness. And we're comparing them versus 2019, because as Jenny mentioned, 2020 was just such an outlier of a year. A lot of this growth that we observed last year, it's just really hard to put a year-over-year benchmark onto. And so when we look at this, from now versus 2019, you really see how Pinterest has kind of separated itself from the rest of the pack. When we look at these demand mentions, those have increased nearly 50% versus 2019. And you also see that happiness is, a lot higher versus peers. I think it's almost, or more than 20 points higher than, say, a Facebook. However, you can also look at the size of the dots on this chart, and that represents the total mention volume that we're measuring. So obviously Pinterest is, it's positioned itself more in that top right part of the chart, which is great, but it's a smaller dot whenever you compare it versus, look at that Facebook and Instagram and how large they are. And I think that's reflected even in, the stats from that tweet. You're talking millions versus billions whenever you're looking at like a Pinterest versus a Facebook overall. And so I think it's interesting to watch this moving forward. We're definitely seeing, still continued strength out of Pinterest, and we still think that there's a lot of growth potential in this name, and especially improvement if, as Kevin noted, they can start to, get these advertising dollars out of these international users more on par with the users from the United States.
Megan, really quickly, because I'm not an expert on Pinterest, why do you think there's such a disparity between money spent in the U.S. and money spent internationally? Or is it just probably some data that says, no, that's pretty consistent industry-wide, that the U.S. spends more, U.S. users spend more money per click than international users? Is that a Pinterest problem, or is that a social media problem in general where U.S. users are spending more money than international?
I believe that is something that's more of an industry trend that you see where U.S. spend tends to be higher. That's something that we talk about a lot of times in terms of, monetization of international users. Some of that could be with the brand partnerships that Pinterest has. Maybe those favor, the U.S. buyer or the North American buyer. I know that one thing that Pinterest has done recently that we've got an eye on is they've created this shop mode. And so what that does is it allows the user to turn a filter on and only be served with shoppable ads, which to me, that's like basically saying only serve me advertisements, which if you are a brand or if you're an advertiser, that's like a dream that you can present yourself to consumers who are looking to shop. And so I think that that's one way that Pinterest has kind of distinguished itself. It's visually based, a lot like the Instagrams of the world. And that's why we're seeing definitely more traction when it comes to shoppability and discoverability out of the Pinterest and Instagrams of the world. But really for Pinterest, when we talk about those mentions of consumers actually using the app to discover a brand or product or make a purchase, those are up by more than 40% year over year. On the flip side, we're actually starting to see some decline, or it's definitely falling a little bit for Facebook and Instagram. So I think that's something to continue to watch to see if that separation continues, if consumers increasingly turn to sites like a Pinterest to find these things to buy. And that's definitely something we've got an eye on looking ahead to see if that'll continue to drive that growth and continue to drive those conversion rates.
Megan, I think this is the point when you're comparing some of these different companies. Facebook, in many ways, is its own beast. Its problems are going to be more regulatory, potentially scalability, continued integration of all these different platforms. But let's talk the other two, because I think that these two are almost polar opposite in terms of how you interpret an advertisement as a user. Pinterest, its biggest issue seems to be maybe its demographics kind of pigeonholed it into a smaller potential user base overall. It can maybe work to expand that, but as you mentioned, a shop mode, welcome to ads. It's part of the experience. You're going there for idea generation. You're wanting these ideas to be given to you. You're wanting these advertisements. On Snapchat, I've always thought, isn't that extraordinarily intrusive to have an advertisement between seeing what your friends are up to? And so I think that's the biggest issue when you look at those two in terms of a difference between the two companies and what they're trying to achieve. And is that really indicated by the vertical axis, the y-axis here on this chart, which is consumer happiness, looking to be significantly higher for Pinterest than Snap?
Yeah, I think that you hit the nail on the head there. It really comes down to what consumers are using the platform to do. And so whenever you think of a Pinterest, this isn't necessarily, I wouldn't consider this as socially connecting, connecting with friends or sharing your own personal things. This is more of a seeking to find new ideas, seeking to find something. You are actually going into that discovery mode. And so that's why you see, happiness is very high because that's what Pinterest is made to do. On the flip side, Snapchat is more of a traditional social site. This is where users are going to send a lot of times just direct messages to each other. I know that just anecdotally, my younger siblings, they use this for what I would use to text message. They send messages on top of just like random photos of themselves directly to friends. And so I think that this is a completely different use case. So in that instance, ads can become intrusive, and that's a lot of times why you see that happiness lower, that people don't like these ads that they're being served. A lot of times people are talking about the ads that they're being served aren't relevant to them. So maybe there's a little bit of a targeting issue there as well. But I think that there's definitely a different use case when you think of why are consumers using Snapchat? It's to connect with other people, to connect with their peers. Why are consumers using Pinterest? It's to discover things. And so that definitely sets these companies up for a different trajectory when it comes to, the effectiveness of advertising on their platform.
Megan, we got to leave it there, but if I'm going off the data and you can just give me a quick yes or no, is it, if you rank ordered them, Pinterest, Facebook, Snapchat?
Yeah, I think you hit it.
All righty, Megan Brantley, always a pleasure, the VP of Research at LikeFolio.com. Look forward to talking to you again soon. All right, Kev.